Right.
All right. Okay.
All right.
Good day, everyone. Wonderful to see you. It is a really great pleasure to introduce Bhikhu Parekh, a dear old friend over a long, long time. And there was a plan. You would come in person, Bhikhu, but just back from India, you wouldn't do that. And now you speak from Hull. Bhikhu Parekh was Vice Chancellor of University of Baroda, Deputy Chair of Commission for Racial Equality, is author of the Parekh Report on the Future of Multi-Ethnic Britain, and is member of the House of Lords with a large oeuvre of studies, such as books on Karl Marx, colonialism, Gandhi, multiculturalism, several books, influences that inspire his approach to global ethics are analytical philosophy, among others the influence of Michael Oakeshott, I think, Bhikhu, index civilization, and dialogues with colleagues such as Charles Taylor, Stuart Hall, Tariq Moudud. It is also, he is the recipient of so many honors and awards, they cannot be reasonably listed. So please, Bhikhu, it's wonderful that you are joining us. A warm welcome, please. Over to you, Bhikhu. How about for some 40 minutes? Would that be good?
Well, thank you very much, Jan. I'm most grateful to my good friend, Professor Jan Nederling-Petersen, for inviting me to participate in this series of lectures. Lectures so far have been delivered by eminent experts in the relevant areas, and I cannot, alas, pretend to be one of them. To say that my good friend Jan has made a mistake in inviting me would be to question his capacity for judgment. To say that he hasn't made a mistake is to be too incredibly arrogant and narcissistic. So all I can do is to accept the honor and get on with the job of delivering my address. Globalization refers to a process by which all societies become part of a coherent and well-knit globe. They lose their isolation and come to constitute an interdependent system. No society is immune to the impact of others, and what happens in one of them, directly or indirectly, affects others. Globalization is a matter of degree, the highest degree being represented by a fully integrated world in which no part is detached or capable of operating independently of the others. We are not there yet, but seem to be increasingly moving in that direction, despite attempts by some powerful countries to restrict the flow of globalization from time to time. Globalization is not a simple and homogeneous phenomenon. It occurs at different levels, in different degrees, in different areas, such as the economic, the political, and the cultural. It is easier to regulate in some areas than in others. It is a human phenomenon, not a natural process, and is subject to human control. But it occurs as a result of human inventions, creativity, unplanned and unanticipated actions, and has as a result an air of unpredictability and inexorability. Economic globalization is easier to recognize, compare, and measure, and has naturally tended to be at the center of our attention. Political globalization, although related to the economic, has its own logic, its own rhythm and dialectic. Loose and hard alliances between states get formed and bind them in a system of interdependence. The European Union, the Commonwealth, the NATO are all examples of or steps in the direction of political globalization. And so are terrorist movements, anti-war movements, and fundamentalist religious campaigns. By their very nature, political alliances tend to have an adversarial orientation and rarely aim to encompass the whole globe. However, the line between the political and the economic is not easy to draw, and some political arrangements have a global scope, such as, for example, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the United Nations. Cultural globalization is another form of globalization. By culture, I mean not just the so-called high culture, but all that informs a society's way of life, such as its ideals, habits, social practices, diet, and dress. More and more people the world over dress alike. Even women, the traditional transmitters of cultural identity, are beginning to dress alike. This is also true of commercial and residential architecture, interior decor, forms of sexual self-expression, and forms of friendship. All forms of globalization have both beneficial and harmful consequences. Economic globalization makes the national economy competitive, improves the quality of products, raises the current level of technological sophistication, facilitates the movement of labor, reduces the prices of goods and services, and makes them more easily accessible to the large masses of people. It also attracts foreign investment, facilitates outsourcing, and reduces disparities between countries. Economic globalization, however, also has harmful consequences. It subjects national economies to the vagaries of the international market, encourages currency speculation, tends to reduce developing countries to the producers of raw material, floods their markets with imported goods, increases unemployment, at least in the short run, creams off talent, and causes brain drain. Cultural globalization also has mixed consequences. It encourages intercultural borrowing, widens the horizon of the national culture, facilitates movement and communication among peoples, brings the world together in a spirit of human solidarity, pluralizes the national culture and allows different traditions and strands to develop, and offers a critical perspective on it. But it also threatens the integrity of the national culture, creates divisions between the globe-trotting elite and their ordinary fellow citizens, threatens social cohesion, poses a threat to the country's sense of identity and common belonging, and so on. These consequences of globalization, both beneficial and unwelcome, are related to globalization in three different ways. First, some are inherent in globalization and inseparable from it. One can, of course, stop globalization, but that is often not easy and is frequently harmful. So that's one set of consequences arising from the fact of globalization as such. Second, some consequences are inherent not in globalization per se, but rather in the currently dominant neoliberal form. This is not the only form of globalization, but for a variety of reasons, it has become dominant and forms the framework within which globalization is made to operate. And thirdly, some consequences of globalization follow, not because they are inherent in globalization, nor because they are inherent in a particular version of it, but in the historical context in which globalization currently operates. This includes the vast inequalities, injustices, inequities, legacies of imperialism, disparities in power and influence, and so on, all of which provide the context in which globalization has to operate and which give it a particular shape and structure. We cannot step out of globalization without paying a heavy price, which hardly any country is willing to pay. We have therefore little choice but to remain open to globalization. At the same time, we cannot meekly live with its unacceptable consequences and pay the heavy price that it exacts. After all, we have seen in my earlier discussion some of the unacceptable consequences of globalization, and I could spell out more. It denies human rootedness, the importance of the local, which is no less significant than the global. It denies the importance of locality in human life and in one's way of understanding human life. It shows little concern for the weak and the poor, and it throws them at the mercy of the forces of the market. It has little regard for the enormous moral and psychological damage inequality causes. It is not worried about the human loss of control over their affairs and the consequent damage to the human sense of freedom. Globalization moves on with an air of inevitability and inexorability and generates the feeling of being governed by impersonal forces existing and operating independently of us. In short, our problem is, and this is why I state the problem of this lecture, in short, our problem is how to use globalization for emancipatory purposes. That is to say, how to respond to it in a way that respects the human sense of freedom and justice and helps create a better world. This requires human beings to agree on common purposes, strive for their realization, and thereby to guide globalization in the desired direction. This requires a carefully worked out and consensually grounded global ethics and global politics. I shall concentrate in this address on global ethics and leave global politics out for the time being. So the question that I'm going to be discussing now is how do we develop a global ethics which can help us counter the unacceptable impact of globalization. Now, global ethics cannot be derived from some infallible source, such as the divine will, nor can it be derived from a universal consensus, but there is none, nor from some foolproof test, such as the Kantian universalizability test or Rawls's veil of ignorance. Rational discussion and deliberation and drawing on the historical experience is the only way to arrive at a global ethics. This involves examining different moral principles, weighing up the reasons for and against them, and settling on those that on balance seem more convincing and command a broad cross-cultural consensus. Moral deliberation is comparative in nature. We decide in favor of some principles rather than others, not because arguments for them are irrefutable, for such certainty is rare in human affairs, but because they are stronger and more convincing than those for the alternatives. It is not therefore enough for the critic to say that our arguments are inconclusive, as that is a necessary feature of all moral reasoning. He or she needs to show that a much better or an equally good case can be made for the opposite principle. Reasons relevant to deliberation on a global ethics are of several kinds, of which three are particularly important, three kinds of reasons. Some are empirical and appeal to the well-established and cross-culturally instantiated facts about human beings, such as, for example, that they are mortal, prone to disease, decay and pain, have certain basic desires, needs and capacities, flourish or wither away under certain conditions, suffer at the loss of loved ones, and have limited knowledge of themselves. These facts circumscribe the scope of moral principles as well as provide part of their content. They tell us what human beings can or cannot do and set limits to what can be morally expected of them. Some other morally relevant reasons are rather complex in nature. For convenience and because they have been used by philosophers over the centuries, I shall call them philosophical reasons. They presuppose a particular way of understanding human beings, a more or less coherent conception of what it is to be human. We arrive at it by locating human beings in the world around them, identifying and critically reflecting on their distinctive capacities and determining their meaning and significance. The resulting general conception of human beings provides a framework within which we discuss how they should be treated and determine the relevance and weight of our reasons. Third, some morally relevant reasons are experiential or prudential in nature and constitute what some earlier writers called practical wisdom. They are reflective distillations of the past and present experiences of different societies and the lessons that can be drawn from them. They tell us what is and what is not practicable, what is likely to have which long-term consequences, and so on. We can, for example, show by appropriate historical and contemporary examples that identification of state and religion corrupts both, that absolute power corrupts not only in the mundane sense of creating vested interest, but also in the deeper sense of breeding self-righteousness and intolerance of disagreement. That the self-evident moral truths of yesterday turn out to be falsehoods tomorrow, and so on. We can also show that inequalities beyond a certain point corrupt all involved, that degrading groups of human beings exacts a heavy emotional and moral price from its alleged beneficiaries. In short, deliberation on global ethics is a highly complex activity. It involves assessing, relating, and weighing of reasons for and against different principles and values. I would like briefly to explore what kind of global ethic is generated by looking at these different kinds of reasons. Human beings, and this is the kind of the global ethic that I would see generated by the kinds of reasons that I have discussed so far. Human beings are endowed with several capacities that mark them out from the rest of the natural world. These include the capacity to think, to reason, to reflect, to use language, to imagine things unseen, to dream of better life, to enter into moral relations with one another, and so on. Although these capacities are related, they are different in nature and cannot all be reduced to any one of them. Say reason, for example. So, through these capacities, humans introduce a wholly novel and uniquely human form of existence. They are able to rise above the automatic and inexorable processes of nature, understand and control them, and act as self-determining and responsible agents. They build rich inner worlds of distinctively human emotions and give depth and meaning to their lives. They also create a public world of aesthetic, literary, scientific, religious, and other achievements. As beings capable of creating meaning and value and leading lives based on them, human beings deserve to be valued themselves and have intrinsic value or dignity or worth. Worth or dignity is not a natural fact. like eyes and ears, but rather a status we confer upon human beings. It is a moral judgment, and like all judgments, based on what we take to be good reasons for valuing freedom, duty, truth, and so on. Human beings have dignity or worth because they are capable of doing dignified or worthy things. And their worth is intrinsic, not contingent, intrinsic, because it is based on capacities and achievements that are constitutive of their humanity. Human beings not only have, or what comes to the same thing, should be accorded intrinsic value or worth, but they have worth in equal measure. They have needs that are as compelling in the case of one of them as that of another, and they are subject to common vulnerabilities and misfortunes that are as much a part of one man's life as that of another. They need common conditions to flourish, and in their absence, they decay and wither away. They all seek meaning and fulfillment in their lives and feel frustrated and disorientated when their lives offer neither. Yet another reason for equality relates to the fact that it leads to a richer and more relaxed society than does inequality. Human beings depend on each other for their sense of self-worth and all-round development. When they are treated as inferior or as of no worth, they tend to internalize these images, take a poor view of themselves, aim low, fail to develop their talents, and build up resentment against those subjecting them to such treatment. Unlike inequality, which stifles the potential and stunts the growth of those treated as inferiors, equality releases their energies, unshackles their talents, and enables them to make their unique contribution to society. So that's how I would argue for equal worth and what follows from this. I've argued that there is a powerful case for assigning equal worth to human beings, and that it is stronger than for the opposite principle. The principle of equal worth has several important implications. It involves respect for another's life or bodily integrity, not just life as a physical survival, but bodily integrity. Bodily integrity is the very basis of human agency and an integral part of human worth. Since the sense of an individual's worth in his own eyes is bound up with what others think of him and how they treat him, the principle of equal human worth requires a broad equality of social status, power, and life chances. This does not mean that we may not admire some people more, because that depends on their individual capacities and achievements. Nor that all should enjoy equal wealth and income, but that depends on their contributions to social well-being. Rather, it requires that such inequalities as are necessary and inescapable should satisfy certain conditions. These inequalities should not extend to basic social, economic, political, and other rights, treat some as less than full human beings. They should not be interlocking such that inequality in one area leads to that in another, or so entrenched and self-perpetuating that they close off worthwhile careers for and deny equal life chances to large sections of people. Furthermore, the principle of equal human worth requires that all human beings should be able to lead lives and affirm and nurture their sense of worth. They flourish under certain material and social conditions and have equal claims to them. Their fundamental interests include physical security, the satisfaction of their basic needs, good health, opportunities for growth, and so on. They also include the development of those capacities without which they cannot function effectively. The organization and conduct of their collective life should also sustain and affirm their equal worth. Since human beings cannot affirm and realize their equal worth in the absence of these and the related conditions, these conditions constitute great human goods and their opposites great human evils. Poverty, terror, institutionalized humiliation, degrading working conditions, Objection to the arbitrary will of others, a lack of basic rights, being the playthings of their rulers and impersonal forces of the market, destroy the very substance of their humanity. The consciousness of equal human worth does not arise and cannot be sustained in a social vacuum. It needs to be embodied in social, economic, political, and other institutions and become a matter of daily experience. I have so far been concerned to show how we might go about developing a historically relevant global ethic. I argued earlier why all human beings have or should be assigned equal worth and what this entails. It implies that human beings make equal claims to the promotion of their fundamental interest, and that imposes duty on others. War and brutality that goes with it have no place in a well-considered ethical system. Given human imperfections, war and brutality do occur, but every effort should be made to put in place institutions and cultivate virtues that discourage them. Desire for domination, for controlling others' lives, to prescribe how others should live, greed, arrogance, self-righteousness are all qualities that feed wars and discourage peace and civility. In global ethics, one of whose primary concerns should be to create and maintain a culture of peace and civility, should actively discourage these institutions and vices. Another important constituent of a global ethic is the principle of human solidarity. As I argued earlier, human interests are closely intertwined in our interdependent world, and it is becoming increasingly difficult for the members of any society to lead secure and decent lives unless others do so too. We also face common problems and cannot tackle them on our own. Forces of globalization acquire a momentum of their own and reduce human beings to becoming their playthings unless human beings act collectively and use the forces to promote human well-being. Our actions have profound consequences for future generations who have as much worth as we have, and we may not act in a manner that damages their vital interests. We inhabit a fragile planet with finite resources, and if some overuse them, everyone pays the price. All this means that the world is our collective responsibility. Humankind as a whole should be our moral point of reference, and we need to think and act together in the spirit of human solidarity. Taken together, all that I have said so far, point to a world in which human beings are equally valued, lead free and fulfilling lives, deal with their problems and nurture their shared world in the spirit of human solidarity, and cherish and profit from their individual and collective differences. Whatever else we aim at, and there is much else, these, what I have emphasized, represent the minimum that should guide our individual and, in particular, collective choices. They generate obligations to fellow human beings, wherever they happen to live. They obviously extend to fellow members of a shared political community. These members are bound to each other by countless ties. They have a common interest in maintaining a stable community, a system of basic rights and liberties, and a general climate of civility and mutual trust. So I argue that human beings have obligations to each other, and these obligations extend not only to the members of their own community, but also to those outside. In other words, they have special obligations to the members of their own community, but they have general obligations to people outside. And how do these relate to each other? They have a common interest in maintaining a stable community, They are required to pay taxes for the benefits of others, to die for their country, and to bear their share of the burden of maintaining a common life. They benefit in various ways from their membership of the community and acquire mutual obligations based on fairness and gratitude. Since they grow up within and are shaped by it, they are also generally attached to the community and identified with it in varying degrees. They see it as their community, feel responsible for it, take an active interest in its affairs, and feel proud or ashamed when it does or does not live up to their expectations of it. Through all this, relations between citizens are a form of spatial relations. While we are bound to our fellow citizens by spatial ties, we also have obligations to outsiders. They arise from the principles of human dignity and equal worth discussed earlier. In modern times, these obligations are reinforced by global interdependence, which I discussed earlier. Our actions affect distant others, and we are responsible for their consequences. We face common problems and cannot tackle these without seeking the willing cooperation of others and taking into account their interest. In a globalizing age, groups in society judge themselves comparatively, and those feeling neglected or unjustly treated become breeding grounds for deep resentment and cause havoc in distant lands. The enlightened self-interest of each country provides an additional reason to be concerned about others. Our citizenship then has both a national and a global dimension. For convenience, I shall call it globally orientated citizenship. It is wider and deeper than the traditional view of citizenship, which limits it to a particular community. It is also different from global or cosmopolitan citizenship. Which implies that one is a citizen of the world, has no spatial ties to a particular community, no political home, and is in a state of what Martha Nussbaum calls voluntary exile, a condition she welcomes, but which is difficult to live in and for which there is little to say. When one grows up in a particular community, one understands it better than any other and is bound to it by spatial ties. If one continues to live in the community and enjoys the benefits of its citizenship, one also acquires certain obligations to it, which one doesn't have to others. In contrast to a global citizen who is in exile everywhere, a globally oriented citizen has a home of his own, from which he reaches out to others with equally valued homes of their own. He appreciates the reality and value of the community and is an internationalist rather than a cosmopolitan. With all their limitations, political communities, in one form or another, have long been an integral part of our lives, and we have a considerable knowledge of how to run and regulate them. They inspire their citizens to look beyond narrow self-interest and to identify with millions of relative strangers whom they will never meet, and some of whose views and lifestyle they might abhor. For these and other reasons, political communities represent a valuable political resource. We should make use of them, expand their moral boundaries to include outsiders, and mobilize the legitimate pride of their citizens to pursue wider human interests. This is a better way to proceed than to rely on a tenuous and free-floating cosmopolitan consciousness, which is at best limited to only a few human beings. A global human identity cannot be created by dismantling or bypassing national identities, because it then remains abstract, distant, and lacks a basis in lived reality. Rather, we should redefine, reinterpret, and use them as its necessary stepping stones. A secure national identity is built on strong civic and regional identities. The global human identity is no different. Our duties to humankind are best discharged through the mediating agency of the state, and we become better globally oriented citizens by activating our national citizenship. It's a common experience that those who identify with their community and feel a sense of responsibility for its actions are often the most likely to feel ashamed when it behaves badly. Apathetic citizens who have no interest in the conduct of their government are neither good national nor good global citizens. Globally oriented citizenship calls for a democratic deepening of national citizenship and is not its rivals but a necessary complement. Now, globally oriented citizens, therefore, should strive for a world order based on the principles of global ethics discussed earlier. They should seek to design global financial and other institutions in such a way that they regulate global forces and subordinate them to the service of humanity. As globalization proceeds, global ethics is needed to keep pace with it. The content, the agents, the scope of ethics change, and so do the grounds on which they are defended. I have suggested that what such a global ethics might look like and what its underpinning would be. We might disagree with its contents, but I hope not with its necessity and property in our and propriety in our deeply troubled world. Thank you.
Thank you, Bhikhu. Thank you very much. You offer us a horizon of general sensibilities and principles, analytically grounded, philosophically grounded. Please, I invite people to share questions or comments.
Lord Parekh, if I may, can you hear me? Sorry.
I can, yes.
Yes. Thank you so much for your work over the years. It's really, really important, all that you have been doing. I understand you have just returned from India. And I have a long association with India myself, having lived there 5 years, and I go back there for research, mostly in the South, although recently I was in Baroda with a dear friend. And I'm wondering what your views of India right now are, and of course, Ukraine, and particularly India's relation with Russia. You know, much of what you've shared here is absolutely wonderful, very optimistic and all. You know, I sometimes am accused of being a Pollyanna. Perhaps you are too, I'm not sure. I would love to hear your thoughts on the Ukraine and India right now and where we are in relation to your topic.
Well, I think India's policy on the Russian-Ukraine war has been reasonably clearly stated. And you must remember that India's relations with Russia have been fairly close the last 60 years. Russia has been a good friend through thick and thin and has defended India on Kashmir and other issues. 70% of our defense equipment comes from Russia. Russia's alliance with China is also quite important for India. Given its problems with China, Russia as a mediator becomes very important. So for all these reasons, India has been very keen to maintain its relations with Russia. And that was his position. So it said, look, we are not going to condemn Russia. Because condemning it doesn't take you anywhere and is not appropriate in this case. What India said was that what Russia, in general, principle that one country should not be invading another, or should not be violating its sovereignty. That principle India has affirmed, but not the individualization of that principle in the sense of criticizing a specific country's attack on a specific country. So, yes, sovereignty of another country should be respected, but stopping there and not taking the next step of saying Russia should therefore be condemned. Because there the Indian argument would be, which country would we leave alone? American record is no better than the Russian. The British record is no better. And given all that, and the history of imperialism attached to this, given all that, the list of countries to condemn will be enormously long. We affirm the principle, live it in that. Now, whether it is right or wrong, it is not for me to decide, but I would say that given the independence of India, militarily and in other areas, and the close relationship between the two, I think it's a strategically important move and welcome.
Bhikhu, thanks. I acknowledge two Indian colleagues, Amit Ahuja and then Anshu. Please, Amit.
Thank you so much, Jan. And Professor Parekh, may I just say what a pleasure and what an honor it is to be listening to you today and to be engaging in this conversation. I have followed your work as a student for many, many years. So it's a real pleasure to be able to talk to you today. I thought there was a, the central proposition in play here is very interesting, which is that you want nationalism or the national political community to be at the heart of developing a consensus around global ethics and values that will allow us to face some of the challenges that globalization raises and also enhance the benefits of globalization. And if that's one of the central ideas in play that you're sort of asserting, then it raises another sort of interesting question in terms of based on what some of the contemporary nationalisms look like, whether it's the kind of nationalism which is being referred to, which is being mobilized in the United States, which is in some ways, arguing for enhancing inequalities, or for that matter, the nationalism in India, again, which has at its heart, the exacerbation of a certain kind of inequality among faiths. So my point is that, the question that sort of arises is that when the basis, the foundations of these new emergent nationalisms is so deeply problematic, how do we leverage them to create a global norms, values, and ethics to face our challenges? Thank you.
Well, I think, Jan, may I respond to that?
Please, Bhikhu.
Well, I think it's a very important question. And not just one, but several questions rolled in one. You're absolutely right in saying that the global ethic has more chance of taking off if it was consensually grounded and if it had the support of backing of various countries whose conduct it is expected to regulate. Entirely agree. And therefore the question is, how do you bring together these countries? How do they talk to each other so as to arrive at a body of common principles? Now, the way in which we arrived at the United Nations statement on Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where you had Arab countries, communists, others, they were all able to agree through give and take, through giving reasons why certain rights were more important than others. So I think that that's absolutely right. And which is the point I was making, that rather than think of these rights, think of this global ethic as emerging from nowhere, build it up slowly, just as global citizenship is not built on the ashes of the national citizenship, rather it is built out of national citizenship. So this Hegelian dialectic, moving from one step to other, is something that I would endorse. Does that answer your question, Avi?
Yeah, so it does. But I want to sort of think a little bit more broadly here, which is like how. So given that we acknowledge the significance of nationalism, how do we leverage these nationalisms whose foundations? Because I'm sort of thinking about let's go back to India. What is fascinating is the post-colonial nationalism, or the nationalism, anti-colonial nationalism of India, in many respects, gave it the language in some ways to contribute to a conversation on global ethics. But whereas, I don't know how the Hindu nationalism of today's India allows it, or how does it help it contribute to a global language? Like, how does today's India engage in developing global ethics?
Yes, I think your use of the word nationalism is slightly confusing the issue for me, because I wouldn't see any room for any kind of nationalism in the development of global ethic. Because nationalism, as I understand it, would simply say, why do you want a global ethic to start with? Nation is the highest moral ideal for any human being. Nation is the place, nation is the idol to die for. Now, this is what a nationalist would say. In which case, why would he want to go for anything beyond the nation? So nationalism, in the form in which it is normally understood, will have to be pruned a little. And one would have to think in terms of nation as a kind of political community, rather than an idol, or as Tagore said, these heathen gods, which insatiable thirst for human blood. Yes.
Bhikhu, shall we go to Anshu's question next, and then maybe this theme can take on a greater depth? Amit, thank you very much. Anshu, would you step in, please?
Thank you, Jan, very much. And thank you, Professor Parekh, for this absolutely wonderful talk on global ethics, on which, you put it across so simply, something that we are all, we think about, but get confused quite often, So I really like the way in which you put this across in a simple way. My question is very much like Amit's. So I would say that when you're talking about global ethics and what we need to cultivate, it kind of clashes with what we see around us right now. So given the situation that we find, and going back to the two examples he gave of the United States or India, where you have some kind of a hyper-nationalism, which is growing, and which is not even looking at its own citizens in an equal way, and there is discrimination on the basis of religion. So in this kind of a scenario, and it's not just these two countries, you're seeing it in multiple countries in the world, in this kind of a scenario, how do you move towards even a nationalism which can be enjoyed by all citizens, leave alone a global space where you can have global citizenship that everyone can, grow and increase the kind of potential that they have. So in this highly charged kind of nationalism that we have, growing particularly in India, how do you see things moving forward. And I would particularly like you to go back to your own work on Gandhi, and tell us a little bit about Gandhian relevance of his ideas. There's a lot of lip service that is paid to him without any substantive agreeing with his ideas. So how do you think, Gandhi would have reacted to the present situation, or where does Gandhian thought take us today? Thank you very much.
Bhikhu, may I insert one small point? A dear friend from Kiev, Taras Simbal, has just joined us. He was a previous speaker, and I'm so happy that he is joining us. Please, Bhikhu.
Shall I?
Yes, please.
Yeah. No, I think our questions are both very important. The first question is, how do we move from where we are, where I think we should be? A world in which people are at each other's throat, where religious fanatics are involved in all kinds of struggles and conflicts, where all around us we see violence and war and bloodshed. How do we get people even to argue about the basic principles? And then I'm sorry, I don't see an answer. I don't see an answer, except a kind of rationalist faith that perhaps if people can be persuaded to get together and talk, there may be some opening, some space for new ideas. And I can't believe that there is any group of individuals which is so opaque to reason that it can't be reached. Even the terrorists, when it comes to think about them, even the terrorists are terrorists not because they want to be. They have a certain goal in mind. Now, why is their goal? Why are they doing this? And I think increasingly you see the way in which the terrorist movement starts and abates and disappears and all that, it has its own logic. So I would say that the belief in some kind of rational deliberation, rational thinking, ultimately is the only way one can go further. But what is the other way? You can't clobber them, you can't lock people up, you can't force them. So that's one. And this also on the question of what the Mahatma would have said, I think Mahatma would have said something similar. He encountered fanatics in his own life. He met some in England when he was here. He met many throughout his life. They spread all kinds of stories about him, gossip about him. And one of them eventually got him. Now, his answer would roughly be mine, which is in all these cases, what you need to do is to open their hearts, he would say. This is not my language, but his language. Then there are these terrorists and others, he says, if you can open their hearts. How do you open their hearts? You stand firm before them. Satyagraha, and that sort of thing. So his own answer would ultimately be to get people to appreciate what it is that you are saying and get them out of that narrow world in which they are caught up. I don't see what else he could have said beyond that.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, please. Satyajit, I also want to add a little remark, Bhikhu, is a consideration that in the setting in which we are, we tend to often use macro, large, aggregate concepts like nationalism. Does it make sense to distinguish two kinds of nationalism, inward-looking, outward-looking? They go by the same name, but they have very different meanings. We use large aggregate concepts like globalization, capitalism, without distinguishing different types, or concept like a state. And in a certain way, then we tend to talk in circles. Sorry, this is just a little intervention.
No,
please.
go on. You're saying something very interesting.
Yes, but please combine this remark then, if you want to react, where Sati's points. Please, Sati, over to you, and then you come in. Bhikhu, please.
Professor Parekh, thank you for that very fascinating talk. I think there is another point which you're making. I don't think you've elaborated that enough, which is the Hegelian dialectic at play. I mean, so if you could kind of elaborate a little bit more on that, largely because this hasn't been really a dominant nationalism in a place like India for a long period of time. Even Ambedkar talked about two nations. So there has been the idea of, is it a nation or is it a different, many nations within there? So this idea of Hegelian dialectic, which you talk about, of conversation, how does that take place? The second question which I have is really more in terms of a practical utilitarian one, which is in terms of, is there a global ethics which is emerging in the form of, let's say, the Millennium Development Goals, now the Sustainable Development Goals? This is what a common person is really concerned about. And how does a framework in terms of rights intervene with the logic of what you're trying to advocate?
Now, can you elaborate a little?
For example, climate change is a big issue, right? And there are a number of, climate change is a big issue. The Millennium Development Goals the Sustainable Development Goals has a few indicators in terms of trying to achieve a particular goal towards universal access, rights, ensure that certain marginalities which are there are kind of dealt with. So there is a creation of some kind of an order through an intervention like the Sustainable Development Goals. So where does your architecture come in terms of addressing this parallel movement which is also happening?
By parallel movement, you mean movement involving climate change and other goals?
Yes.
And your question is, what do I make of those movements, or
how does your work intersect with that?
Well, it sits very nicely with that kind of movement. But I thought you were raising some very interesting questions. When you were talking about climate change, you made a remark. I can't repeat it exactly as you said it, but you were saying that individual climate change is an issue which either we do it collectively or it will never be done. It's not something that one individual can do. All of us have to share. Now, if all of us have to do this, on what ground? If I am not bothered, and if it is going to cost me quite a bit, why should I waste my time responding to climatic factors when it doesn't affect me? So what I then have to do is to put myself in the shoes of others and say, well, look, it may not affect me directly, but it's a matter of concern to my fellow human beings. It's a human problem. It's a problem for the world which I inhabit, and hence it's a problem for me. Not directly for me. Now that is something which a liberal way of thinking cannot recognize, because for him a problem is a problem only if it affects me. It's my problem. Can something become my problem when it is not my problem? Do you see what I mean? Then this is where I think the climate change people and others seem to be facing an acute problem. You go to people and say, look, use a light bulb of a certain kind, or don't use a very powerful light bulb, or don't use too much of water and so on. And you might say, look, I have got into the habit of doing this. Why shouldn't I do this? What we have to say is, look, it's your social responsibility. But why is it my responsibility? Because if you keep doing this, it'll affect the world. But the question is, if it affects the world, how is it going to affect me? It doesn't affect me. So since the important thing is to take the step from me to you, where one eye has to accept responsibility as a human being for humanity. Now, on this question of nationalism, which has come up again and again, I think we need to be very careful. If you look at the Indian discourse on political thought, on which I've done some work, Gandhi doesn't talk about nation. The word he often uses is praja, which means a people. And the distinction between the people and the nation is very important. Gandhi says, yes, we are a people, which means united by a common culture and so on, but we don't have all the antecedents that a nation requires. When you come to Tagore, I mean, he has again, nationalism for him is a kind of instrumentalist way of thinking where the state is used for certain purposes. So I think nationalism is a way of, how do you define nationalism? If you simply mean I care for my country, I love my country, fine, no problem. But if you go a step further and say I love my country more than anyone else, fine, okay, that also is all right. But if you say I love my country and eat alone, fine. But then if you take the next step and say I hate others, that's where the problem begins. The problem for a nationalist begins not by his attitude to his own nation, but by his attitude to others. And that's where I think Gandhi and Tagore and Nehru and all the others were absolutely on the right side, because they always talk about India as a nation, but never talk of hating anyone. Even when India broke up into India and Pakistan, they never said we hate Pakistan.
Please, may I insert a point and give a welcome to Zainab Bernousi from Rabat to Taras from Kiev, who were on a different time scale, not yet the summertime that here in the US we entered. And so they are joining us for, I wanted to be at the beginning. They are joining us at the last half hour. Welcome to you all, and also sign up to your students. Taras, would you like to come in, since we are talking about, well, different nationalisms? And some nationalism denies the viability or the right to have nationalism in another country.
Well, it's difficult to do it for me right now because I missed the whole talk due to this confusion with time zones, but I will listen and maybe I will comment something.
Taras, thank you very much. Zainab, dignity has come up, but yes, that was a little while ago. Bhikhu, I was reading Vladimir Putin's essay of July 2021, in which he denied Ukraine as a nation, and listen to his speech of February, in which he did the same thing. So the denial of the very existence of, or the right of, certain people, which India also does in relation to Kashmir, which India is doing again in relation to the women who wish or need to wear a hijab. This denial of rights of others by privileging one's own claims, we find over and over, even in the 21st century, a war of destruction, bringing us to the precipice of great danger in various spheres, economic, survival, sustainably, and so forth. Given your profound perspective on global ethics, how do you react to these kind of drawbacks or setbacks?
I react pretty strongly. When this first happened in Karnataka in India, I was in India at the time, and I was very sad that this sort of thing should have happened, of all places, in India, where people have got used to dress, where uniform was never a particularly important thing, and if it was, it was not limited to a particular kind of clothes. I think my view is 2 or 3 things have got mixed up here. One is this anti-Muslim feeling that the BJP seems to have created a kind of mild hostility to Muslims, and therefore anything associated with Muslims is unacceptable or is a source of anxiety. Who knows, this can escalate into something else, that every hijab wearing woman is a potential terrorist. Because why should anyone want to wear hijab except to show that I am a Muslim and therefore and I'm different from others? So this is seen as in France early on when the whole controversy broke out, that the hijab is seen as identifying yourself as a Muslim rather than as a Frenchman or something else. Same sort of thing people thought in India. So when these girls went to schools saying, oh, we are going to wear this hijab, they say, they are Muslims first, Indians afterwards. That will not do, and therefore the whole thing became rather stupidly political and nationalistic. But there is also this other thing, that there is some kind of order, just as in France. There was this from peasant to Frenchman to citizens, became through the schools playing the role of creating a uniformity in manners and conduct and all that. So if schools have been the transit, schools have been the passage through which girls will become, they shed their earlier background and become common French women, molded in a single mold, where uniform becomes very important because it's what creates a Frenchman. Now, if this is what is happening, and if this is how it is understood in India, then the question is, these girls, by refusing to wear this, they are refusing to be part of the common Indian uniform, the common Indian mode of doing things. So there are 2 different feelings. One is this identifying with, this is a sign of Muslim identity and therefore condemning it. The other is seeing it as a breaking away from any kind of commonality. So these 2 things have to be separate. One is totally to be condemned. The other is at least understand, one can make an attempt to understand why people would think that not having a uniform or having a school requiring a uniform but refusing to conform to the uniform rule was in some sense unacceptable. But it's just sad. It's really sad and depressing that this should have happened, because what they are doing, in fact, is to instigate the girls further to do the same sort of thing. The girls are not going to go away. They say, look, you're stopping us from expressing our religion. We'll continue to do it, going to the Supreme Court and all that, although the Supreme Court has now given a judgment. But I think it's not going to blow over the way in which the government has handled it.
I recall, Bhikhu, that you have talked to Narendra Modi about the attacks that happened on the train in Gujarat, and have asked him to explain about this. And I think he told you he denied any involvement.
Well, that's a private conversation.
Oh, sorry about that.
Between a citizen and his prime minister, but he would obviously say, look, I have nothing to do with it. And I think maybe he's right. Somebody else from his party did this. But that it was done under his watch is obvious, he recognizes it. But that doesn't mean that he himself instigated it. We don't know who.
However, this kind of deniability does not apply to Vladimir Putin, who wrote and he told in a speech quite in the open that, of course, the Ukraine is a Soviet creation. It is not a real country, and the creation took place on Russian soil. So he has declared the non-viability or the non-existence of Ukraine as a nation, and derived from that certain rights. And we now see in a brief period of time, the whole world, practically the whole world, or many are united in rejecting Putin's narrow, self-centered nationalism. Does that give you a sense of encouragement, Bhikhu? The swift rejection of Russia's intervention, Russia's war, special military operation in Ukraine. How many people reject this? Also in Russia, such as the protest on the RT TV station. We sense there a sense of global citizenship, global ethics in the making.
You're reflecting on the issue, and I thought I would like to do that, reflecting on these large issues.
Well, Bhikhu, there are people who wish us from Kiev and from India, and this is global ethics in the process as it is taking shape, as it is being reformed as we speak, and becomes part of policy. Do you think this is now going in some ways in a good direction? Which things are in a good direction and which aren't, please?
Now, what do you yourself think about this whole theme of global ethics? Yeah.
Bhikhu, one, you have outlined general principles of rational deliberation on this. Most of these principles, I think, are non-controversial. We could quibble about details, but the principles themselves, they are givens. And you have then made a distinction between global public goods and evils. The goods, we agree. The evils, what we need to do is to understand, to explore and go to the foundation. Where lies the problem? And this is a question. I will speak at University of Oxford on Zoom tomorrow, and the key question they asked, how do we curb hostile nationalism? The question is not how do we curb nationalism? No, and you acknowledge the local is a part of the global. The national is a part of global ethics. The foundation is there. the issue is hostile nationalism, inward-looking nationalism that does not extend sympathy, empathy, or love to other nations. How do we come to terms with this? We may have to come to terms with it philosophically, psychologically, analytically. There lies the problem. How do we curb this? How do you put limits to it? We have Article 7 of the UN Charter. Instability within a country that endangers the stability beyond the country can be subject to humanitarian intervention, meaning the use of violence. This is a classic principle. The responsibility to protect is another principle. When, at which point do such principles come into action, in your view? And Bhikhu, as you reflect about this, Taras, do you want to come in on this?
Well, yeah, I can make a few comments, and especially concerning your suggestion that maybe we witness some kind of global ethics formation with this reaction of criticism to the actions of the Russian Federation. I don't think that it's a sign of any kind of consensus on global consensus because there is no such consensus. We see here very well that the world is divided in its assessment of what's going on in Ukraine, and some countries maintain their withdrawal and even withdrawal from this situation, and even support of Russia, especially countries in the global East and South. So the consensus which may seem to exist at this point is more like a Western-centric view. I don't have a feeling that it's something global and unanimous. So I think we are quite far from any kind of consensus, and it's more like a new global division that, and maybe even new global confrontation that is being forged in the war that came to Ukraine in the last month. So I'm not optimistic about that.
Thanks, Taras. Please, Anshu, would you come in?
Yeah, thank you, Jan, for letting me come in again. I want to just sort of bring the question that Sir, you spoke about, Professor Parekh, you spoke about, which is that there's also a cultural globalization that's going on, right? And one of the things that you mentioned is that we are all also dressing similarly now. So there is a kind of a homogeneity that you see in many aspects of culture growing, and this creates a sense of anxiety among people. And there is, I think, something to be cherished in heterogeneous cultures and in cultural practices that are specific to, peoples and communities and so on and so forth. And that is something that can be brought down to, this discussion about hijab and the anxiety it creates amongst the dominant sections of society, but also how we can, in fact, nurture diversity, preserve cultural traditions, and let cultures evolve in their own way without necessarily having to impose a kind of a homogeneity on it. So I think these are, larger questions that that create anxieties among people when we talk about kind of cultural homogeneities that are being imposed in a sense. So thank you.
No, I think you're absolutely right about cultural homogeneity. Something to be said for it, but at the same time, it can be allergic to any kind of change or any kind of language in which you think about certain issues.
Isn't it deeply meaningful that countries like France, like India, that have inspired global values also have shown and are showing the limitations of their own processing of these values? France with the emphasis on laïcité in schools and Jacobin uniformity. India with its very limited or contrary interpretation of Gandhi's outlook. So there is a rebalancing process also going on that is part of the process of global values and ethics. Zainab, would you like to comment, please?
Thank you. I was just hoping to be here, and I'm really sorry about the mix-up. I mean, there is so much food for thought. So I'm glad this is recorded. So with my students, we are going to get back to it. But just reflecting on these last points, and particularly thinking about dealing with for instance, the denial of other dignities or other identities, other nationalism, other expressions of different expressions. So, and here thinking also about how do we curb hostile nationalism. So I think this is really an important question to think about. And I think you had elements there, Jan, when you talked about the global political economy. And I think what needs to also be questioned there is why are there those hostile nationalism to begin with, right? Why are there those rejections, right, of the other, those rejections of maybe also homogenization, right? And I think it's really important to also ask why, and it is a symptom of something, right? So thinking and here thinking about the political economy, and I think both of us, Jan, we know Evelyn Lindner, who has a book on dignity economy, and she talks about how, well, looking at a bit of the history, right, of the world economy, how, of course, with growing populations, but also more complex societies, there is this greater competition, right? So that is also then leading to that hostility. So I think that is also that needs to be addressed, right? So instead of thinking about how to limit the hostile, maybe more how to fix, right? What leads to those hostilities. So in terms of managing resources.
Managing?
Resources.
Yeah. No, I agree.
So not to curb, but rather to fix. But how, Zainab? Fix how?
Yeah, that's the question. Well, yeah, in terms of management of resources, so I'm thinking a more sustainable approach also to our economies.
Please, a question, Bhikhu, to you and to the collectivity. What do we now think of the methods applied at present in relation to Ukraine, sanctions, also arms, weapons to Ukraine for their defense in relation to a war of choice, which in many ways seems to be 19th century, early 20th century, conquering territory in some respect post-material world, or a post-territorial world, a supra-territorial world, a throwback to another time. Do you all have the sense, and Bhikhu, do you have the sense that the methods deployed now are appropriate and are also an appropriate expression of global values? Or are they, as Taras thinks, rather an expression of regional values? And I think that because of the deep ties, India, China have different positions, different alignments. This is understandable. But yet ethically, they can be on the same side. But you know, let's not try to assume that everything is legible and transparent. Please, Bhikhu, what's your sense?
May I say? Okay. Well, yeah, I think, of course, this solidarity and the support that Ukraine is receiving really expresses and really shows that there is some kind of consensus among a group of nations that such actions are not appropriate in the 21st century. Actions like the military aggression, absolutely unprovoked military aggression. But some other questions should be raised in this case. This support, the solidarity that Ukraine enjoys at the moment may turn out to be belated. It came too late. Before that, Ukraine was prohibited to have middle-range missile systems and any kind of weapons that could pose any kind of threat to Russia and so on. And these bans were supported by Western nations because they were interested in having good relations with Russia. So it looks like it's more of a power game than any kind of global ethics coming in place. 10 years ago, it was to pacify, to appease Putin's regime by limiting any resources, that military resources that Ukraine can have at its hand. Now it's supporting Ukraine, so it's shifting, and this shifts show that it's situational. I don't think that there is anything new to this. The same thing, almost the same thing, happened to Poland 70 years ago. There were also expressions of solidarity, but no one came to rescue, in fact, and Poland was divided between two dictatorships. So again, I don't see any signs of something new being forged compared to what we have seen in the previous decades of the 20th century.
Taras, isn't it, sorry, but a quick one, isn't it the difference, that radical, profound, immediate difference between February 23, we celebrate with caviar and vodka, besides the champagne, and February 24, vodka and caviar are gone, and they are gone for many people. This is a really swift, the swiftness, the immediacy. So the timing, this timing came immediately. The javelins came a bit later. Sorry, Bhikhu.
Were you asking me to say something?
Yes, yes, please, please. I think I was interrupting you.
No, I think the ethical question does come in, because after all, if we were going to analyze how the Ukrainian crisis came about, there are layers and layers. At each of these layers, you have a moral problem. For example, when Russia says, I don't want NATO in my neighborhood, or I don't want my neighbor to join NATO. I mean, the question is, what gives you that kind of right to claim what your neighbor should or should not do? What is the basis of that claim? Yes. Likewise, there are other issues that he has raised where one asks the same question. And when Americans say we don't want communists in our region, so that when Cuba turned communist, the Americans decided to punish it by boycotting it in all sorts of ways. Why do these big countries have that kind of right, that kind of power? What is the basis of it? And one has to look at the ethics of it. And if one can show that there is no such no validity in those claims, then I think the popular the opinion would be very different. Here, I think people are conceding that Russia was right, that Ukraine should not, to demand from Ukraine that it should or should not join NATO or whatever. Now, probing a little further, I don't see any value in that argument at all.
Yeah, only perhaps it is striking that when the United States bombed and then entered Afghanistan in retribution for 9/11, the Twin Towers, and then later decided that it was a good idea to depose Saddam Hussein in Iraq and bring democracy to the Middle East, it did the United States enormous damage to its reputation, also Britain and so forth. But this was slow in coming. It was a realization, but it went slowly. In this case, the reaction is broad, not universal, but it is broad and it is swift. It's a very fast reaction. So there is, as it were, in the collective consciousness awareness, there is a different level of engagement. And this is, although it is sort of a global consensus, of course it is, this is worse, this is valuable to diagnose. There is, as it were, a greater clarity, collective clarity about this, and that manifests in a faster time. Part of it is the geography, of course. Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, for Europeans are remote, and this is very close by, so there is a certain immediacy that also matters. So, yeah, there is a greater and speedier clarity, which in terms of the development of global ethics, if we think of global ethics as a process, yes, this is meaningful. It's not a given. It's in the making. It's constantly in the making. And February 24, 2022 is a meaningful moment that many have taken as a signal. And I find the expression of courage and commitment also of the TV producer in Arte in Moscow very, very meaningful. I find it also very moving to be a part of.
Okay. Thank you, Jan. I must go and eat now.
So we are ending the session. Brett, are you on the same page? Well, there you are. Bhikhu, thank you very much. And colleagues and friends, wonderful to see you all. Sorry about the time mix-up. Thanks to everybody. Bhikhu, thanks very much. All right.
Well, thank you, Jan, for making it possible.
Thank you very much.
And thanks for your comments.
Thank you.
Valuable, very valuable, as ever.
Thanks. Thanks, everybody.
Wonderful. Yeah, thanks everybody for joining. This is actually the final talk of our series. So yeah, next quarter we're not going to be running a colloquium, so we will see you all again in the fall.
No, not in the fall either.
Not in the fall either.
So maybe in the next winter. All right. Greetings to you all. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Now, Jan, you are speaking at Oxford, aren't you?
Yeah, tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
Their time, your time, 4 p.m.
4 p.m. tomorrow.
Yes.
Where is the link for that?
I will send you the link. I think it was in the flyer I sent you. I think the link is there. I will resend it to you. I will also send it to some of you if you're interested. Taras, I will send it to you. It's about, say, they add to the program. It was postponed because of COVID. And now it is how do we foster connectivity, connectedness between peoples and also ethnic diversity, cooperation. And now it happens while a war of choice is unfolding. And so they've added to the program a question to speakers, how do we curb not nationalism, of course not, but hostile nationalism.
Good, good. Well, we look forward to hearing you tomorrow.
All right.
Look after yourself.
I will be inspired by your contribution also, Bhikhu. Thank you very much. Wonderful to see you all. Taras, it's good to see you. How are you?
Well, as far as it's possible to be well here. Like we had explosions last night. Like I had to jump out of my bed. So not really good.
Well, look after yourself.
James has left now, or James is still there?
He left. Yeah, he's in Switzerland now.
All right. So we will be in touch. Please, Taras, all the best, and we will be in touch. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you too.
Bye.
Bye.
All right. Take care, everyone. I'm going to end the meeting.
All right. Thanks.